So just as Hooks thinks that there's an issue with not having a clear definition of feminism, Marilyn Frye, in this article, it's a selection from a book. We'll return to this book later when we discuss sexism. But she says, look, we've lost a notion of what oppression really amounts to. So here's a quote that I think points this out somewhat well. So when the stresses and frustrations of being a man are cited as evidence that oppressors are oppressed by their oppressing, the word oppression is being stretched to meaninglessness. It is treated as though its scope includes any and all human experience of limitation or suffering, no matter the cause, degree, or consequence. So just as an aside, for anyone that does political science or is interested in political science, we commonly deal with concepts. We often deal with concepts of corruption or concepts of democracy, concepts of clientelism, concepts of what a state is, and so on. And these words are used to represent certain concepts that we have in mind. And there's a real danger of losing grip on what the concept is about with certain definitions that we provide. And this is going to matter for, some might call this construct validity, that the creation of concepts or conceptions or definitions that are used to then be operationalized in our scientific studies or social scientific studies, that they don't actually measure the concept that we want them to. And so what you need is a very clear, theoretically grounded notion of what it is that we're talking about. And she's saying that we're lacking this. And lacking this stretches the concept to meaninglessness. So if our concept of oppression includes the complaints of men who are, and she takes it for granted that men are oppressors in patriarchy, if our conception of oppression includes any suffering that men experience as a consequence of sexist oppression of women, then our conception of oppression is mistaken. And so what she wants to do is clarify our concept so we have a better idea of what the concept is, so that we can apply it to feminist goals and aims. So let's think of the concept. In part, she says, oppression comes from this idea of the word press. And if we think about being pressed, something is caught between or among forces such that one is restrained, restricted, or prevented from moving. So another idea is that one is limited in options, and it's similar to this first conception. So you might be given two options, all of which really expose you to penalty, censure, or deprivation. There's a catch-22. There's no way out. So oppressed people, for example, are often asked to smile and to be cheerful. If they comply, then they admit to being docile or appear docile. They become acquiescent, and that is internally damaging. But if not, then you're exposed to people being mean or bitter, or this might expose you to then consequently rape, arrest, beating, or murder. All of these things have been the consequence of, say, a woman refusing to pick up a man's advances in the street, for example. Another example comes in the form of women's sexuality. So young women are often in a bind of either engaging in sex or not. So if one engages, then one might be called a slut or a whore. She might have to hide or lie about her behavior and juggle risks of unwanted pregnancy or dangerous contraceptives. On the other hand, if she is not engaged, then she is harassed by men who wish to persuade her to relax. So this should say isn't. She is harassed by men who wish her to engage in sex with them, persuade her to relax. She is called frigid. She is called uptight. She's called a bitch. She's called a cock tease. She might be even labeled a lesbian derogatorily. And then this can have really not only these kinds of consequences, but if you think of the context of rape, so if a woman is raped and she is sexually active, then it'll be claimed that she must have liked it. And, if she's not sexually active, well, she's also presumed to like it as well, because she's repressed or she's frustrated. And so the rape really wasn't a rape at all because it's something that she really deep down wanted after all. And what Frye wants to suggest is that this really shows how women are in a bind. Women are in a bind. They're caught between systematically related pressures, and none of the options available are good ones. So we can have all sorts of different pressures, and she wants to argue that it's a lot of these different pressures that really makes the oppression the kind of bad that it is. So women find themselves between all sorts of pressures: one's husband or partner, one's pressures of sexual harassment, pressures of sex discrimination, competing expectations of being either a woman, the role of a wife, the role of a mother, dependence on others, loyalties to racial or ethnic groups, as we've discussed in our discussion of Black feminism, and so on. So there's all these different competing pressures that bear upon a woman. And she gives a really nice metaphor to talk about how this oppression might work. So if you imagine a bird cage, you could think that you could look at it like one wire at a time. If you did, you'd really miss all the others. You might really focus on that one, so you might just think of, oh, the pressure of being one's a wife or a woman or a mother. That might not seem by itself so damaging. You might look up and down at what it means to be a wife. You might be unable to recognize why someone just doesn't do those things that are demanding of you as a wife. So you might look at this wire and think, why doesn't the bird just fly around it? It doesn't look like this one wire is doing it can't itself do any kind of constraining. You might even look at every other wire. You might look at someone's role as a woman, as a mother. You might look at sex discrimination. You might look at these individually and then find that there's nothing about any individual one that inhibits someone's movement. There's no pressure from all sides here. And this, I think, is common in, when women suffer from sexual harassment and people just say, well, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you report this? And I think the idea here is that that response fails to recognize how other competing or other elements, other pressures that are placed on women constrain that kind of activity. So to understand really how a birdcage works, you have to look at them all at once. You can't mistake the forest for the trees, or is it the other way around? You can't mistake the trees for the forest. Anyway, you can't just focus on one wire of the birdcage. Once you look at all of them together, it becomes perfectly obvious that the bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers. And so this is actually something that is very important for the context of understanding oppression. Maybe the people that know what the birdcage looks like are not the people that are doing the oppressing or are the privileged community. And so if someone who is oppressed or not privileged or is mentioning all these social pressures, it's probably best to listen to that perspective so that you can then perhaps get the glimpse of what the birdcage looks like. And then at that point, it will perhaps become very obvious how someone is trapped within a certain set of systematically related barriers. She gives another example about that puts this metaphor a little bit more firmly within the context of issues that women face. So one might consider the holding of doors. So I don't know how common this is in your life. Perhaps this practice is on its way out, but maybe not. Someone might say, look, how is opening a door for a woman, how could that possibly be considered oppressive? Why do women have such a problem with it? Well, Frye's point is that it's a false helpfulness. So it'll be done whether or not it makes any practical sense, whether women are perfectly capable of doing it, whether men might be in a worse condition to do it, whether women have free hands, men don't. So it's kind of always done, whether or not it makes any practical sense. And furthermore, it might encumber women when the men impose themselves awkwardly to get to the door first. And so that's okay, fine. But really what the problem is that these urgencies to help are really a clear counterpoint to the ways in which men might help and in which women might welcome it, but men fail to do so. So men might be doing this performative element, but fail to do their own laundry at home, fail to help with typing a report, fail to mediate disputes among children or relatives and relegate that to women. They might do nothing about rape, or they might do nothing about criticizing sexist jokes. They might care nothing for women's sexual pleasure, and so on, right? So there are all these ways in which men might actually substantively help women, but opening a door is not necessarily one of them, yet that's the one where men might put their most attention. And it has this suggestion that women are physically incapable of opening doors, and it feels as though ultimately it's mocking. So this kind of awkward imposition towards getting to the door first really seems to be a lot like the behavior that maybe one would expect of a servant, even though women are obviously in the subservient role throughout much of life and in much of the context of interactions with men. And so it's this kind of mocking behavior that is imposed upon women. And in fact, if women firmly suggest, no, I don't want you to open the door for me, a man might get actually upset or angry or frustrated or confused and flabbergasted that a woman would deny him this opportunity to be chivalrous. And that's another sense in which this is a kind of bind. It's a catch-22 here. So equipped with this idea of oppression, at least this metaphor that we've been working with, of oppression as these multiple structurally reinforcing networks of pressures on behavior or on oneself that constrain one or press one into comporting into a certain way. She says, look, everyone's subject to social pressures of some sort, someone might argue. Now, to see whether those social pressures amount to oppression, we really have to look at it in context. To be oppression, it has to be the case that it is this kind of social pressure is part of a network of, quote, enclosing structures of forces and barriers tending towards the immobilization and reduction of a group or category of people. So there's a couple elements here that are important. This idea of a network of structures and barriers that tend towards the immobilization of individuals and reduction of someone by virtue of their participation or membership in a group. So three important things: the network element, the barriers towards immobilization element, and the reducing in some sense of someone by virtue of group membership. That's what's required for oppression on her view. So here's an example that she gives from this idea of racial ghettos. So there's segregation between white and black neighborhoods, and she wants to argue this clearly does not oppress white people. The barrier between communities might limit the access of both to each other. So she gives the example that, yeah, white people might not be able to get, quote, good deals at flea markets or something. But this ghettoization is really the product of the intention and planning and action of whites for majority the benefit of whites, to secure and maintain privileges that are available to whites generally as members of the dominant and privileged group. So it might have some kind of bad consequences for whites, some offhand bad ones, but the barrier itself does not exist in a systematic relation with other barriers and forces forming a structure that is oppressive to whites. It is not one wire amongst many. And in fact, the segregation is largely for the benefit of white people, even if there are some minor costs associated with it. So in the context of more explicitly gender, one might argue that, look, service sectors, this punishes men, right? So the roles of being wives or mamas or assistants or girls, the kind of service sector is almost exclusively a woman-only sector. And its boundaries not only can close women, but it actually to a very great extent keeps men out from them. So it'd be hard for a man to get a job in certain kinds of roles like this. So some men might find that this is a control over their choices, and then thus it is a form of oppression against them as well. The argument would continue that therefore this is not sexist oppression against women, this is sexist oppression against all men and women. And while it's true that oppression, patriarchy, it is constraining on men's lives, it does make men's lives maybe go worse in some senses than it otherwise would. She argues that these kinds of situations or these kinds of relegation of these roles to women is really maintained for men's benefit. It consists of the cultural and economic forces and pressures in a culture and economy that is controlled by men. And we'll see with Young how this lines up nicely, I think, with notions of marginalized communities or communities that are relegated to certain behavior or certain jobs, right? So wives, moms, women are relegated largely to these kinds of roles, whereas men have much more culturally accepted and valued positions available to them. That's at least, it seems like, what Frye is trying to get at. So it's not enough that there's a barrier to one's activity or that one suffers because of that barrier. That barrier must also be in a structure which tends to confine, reduce, and immobilize some group to count as oppressive. Another account that she gives, another example in the context of gender, is gender roles, right? So women are expected to cramp their movement, yet be graceful, to have short steps, and to not take up space. Men are also expected, say, not to cry and to be strong. But she wants to say that the pressure of men not crying, that's not an instance of oppression in the same way. When I think of this passage, I also think of like the notion of manspreading that you might have heard or come across, where in, say, buses and public spaces, men have a tendency to spread their legs very widely and take up a lot of space. Or if you're walking down the street, I'm sure if you ask any of the women that you know, it's quite common for men just not to get out of the way when walking on the sidewalk. And so women are constantly having to take other people's spatial location to be a priority for them, that you're supposed to defer to men's taking up of space. Okay, so she wants to say, yeah, okay, so that's happening for women. Men are also not expected to cry, and they're expected to be strong. But then she asks, like, look, whose presence are these behaviors expected to happen in? So largely this is in the presence of men. Men are not necessarily expected not to cry in the presence of women. Of course, there are going to be exceptions, but on average, men are not supposed to cry in front of men. Men can generally cry in front of women. In fact, women usually demand that there's some expression of emotion by their partners or whatnot, even if they're not given. As well, women don't gain anything by the performance of certain accepted movements associated with their gender. So having this kind of cramped movement and so on, having short steps and whatnot, being timid or something. Instead, there's all just losses. There's just mockery or the consideration of one as weak or someone being generally contemptible. And so there are no cases in which she wants to say women are really benefiting from these kinds of roles in this sense. And there are many ways in which men are, or women are expected to be this way in front of men. Women don't particularly need to be like this in front of other women. And then men are largely expected to conform to these roles also in front of other men, and not really in front of women. So the idea here is that, well, who's doing the oppressing here? It's clearly men doing the oppressing, sometimes of other men and largely of other women. Women are not the ones being the oppressors. So concluding our discussion here, what is oppression? Well, one is marked for oppression by membership in a group of some sort, and by virtue of membership in that group, one suffers a series of suffering and pressures, double binds that press upon oneself, that reduce the range of actions available, that subject one to some kind of privation, punishment, or censor. Simply being a man is not what stands between him and a better job, whatever assaults and harassments he might be subject to. Being a man is not what selects him for victimization. She wants to argue or say or conclude that being a man is a thing that counts generally in his favor. And there's like social scientific research that's support of this. If you look at research on hiring, so a lot of times they'll do, there's this method of testing these kinds of things where you send in resumes of that look identical, though one has a stereotypical guy name and the other has a stereotypical girl name, and or a man and woman, male, female, and you find and see like how many resumes get a call back. And these studies have shown that on average, women get called back far fewer times than men get called back, which suggests that being a woman actually counts against one's success in the job market. So with this, this might be considered a satisfactory conception of oppression. Maybe it's not. If you want to look at Jung's view of oppression, you'll get much more, I would say, systematic approach to what oppression is, and that's what we'll turn to next.